The human guard stepped forward. My queen, do not enter. Your husband is not what he seems. The moment I stepped into the throne room for the first time, every head turned, not because I was important, not because I had done something remarkable. They turned because I was human, and to the Valdorians, that was either amusing or confusing, sometimes both at once. My name is Kael Voss. I was 29 years old when I received what every soldier in the 3rd Interspecies Cooperation Division called the worst posting in the known galaxy. Royal Guard, Valdorian Imperial Palace. Planet Valdor Prime, single human. Representative, indefinite term of service. My commanding officer, Colonel Edwin Hale, shook my hand when he told me. He had the kind of handshake that felt like an apology. Think of it as a diplomatic opportunity, he said. The Valdorians requested one of us. They want to show the galaxy they trust humanity enough to let us stand inside their palace walls. He paused. Try not to break anything. That was 14 months ago. Valdor Prime was a beautiful planet. I will say that much. The sky was a deep violet at midday, fading to copper at sunset, and the palace itself was built from a pale stone that seemed to glow faintly from within, like the walls had swallowed every sunrise they had ever seen and were slowly giving them back. The Valdorians themselves were tall, almost 2 m on average, with long, graceful limbs and skin that shimmered faintly under light, showing soft pulses of color depending on their mood. Calm was silver, pleasure was gold, concern was a deep, quiet blue. When I arrived, most of them glowed a faint, polite amber. That, I learned later, was the color of mild amusement. I was assigned to the Outer Royal Guard. Rotation, 12 hours on, 12 hours off. Standing at various posts throughout the palace complex, my fellow guards were Valdorian soldiers, courteous, precise, and entirely convinced that I was there as a gesture of goodwill rather than actual security. They were not unkind about it. They simply worked around me the way you work around a piece of furniture you like, but do not entirely trust to bear. Wait. Private Oren was the one who explained the palace layout to me on my first day. He spoke basic, the shared interstellar language fluently and with a pleasant musical accent. He was also nearly full meter taller than me, which meant every conversation we had involved him looking slightly downward with an expression that I came to recognize as patient tolerance. The East Wing is the public gallery, he told me, walking quickly while I took 2 steps for every one of his. The West Wing is residential, the Queen's chambers, the King's study, the residence hall. You will not be posted in the West Wing. That is reserved for senior guards only. Understood, I said. Your posts will be the main entrance, the council antechamber, and the garden gate. Ceremonial positions mostly. Ceremonial, I repeated. He glanced down at me. You are the first human to serve here, Sergeant Voss. We want to make sure the assignment is comfortable. I smiled and said nothing. In the military, comfortable usually means useless, but I kept that thought to myself. Queen Saren changed everything about how I understood that posting. I saw her for the first time on my 3rd day during a full court assembly. She walked through the hall with a stillness about her that had nothing to do with slowness. She moved quickly, efficiently, but there was no performance in it, no pageantry for its own sake. Every Valdorian noble in the room brightened slightly in her presence. Their skin shifted toward gold, without anyone seeming to realize it. She acknowledged her court with small nods, names spoken quietly, details remembered. She knew which lord had a new child. She knew which minister had been traveling. She noticed things. She also noticed me. She paused as she passed my post at the eastern arch, looked at me directly, not the amused amber I had gotten used to, but a focused, steady silver. Sergeant Voss, she said, her basic was perfect. How are you finding the palace? It is the most beautiful building I have ever stood inside, Your Majesty. Something shifted in her expression, not a smile exactly, more like the decision to take something seriously. Good, she said simply and moved on. After that, she greeted me every time she passed my post, not out of courtesy, or not only out of courtesy. She asked real questions. How did human eyes handle Valdor's light spectrum? Whether the gravity adjustment had been difficult, what Earth looked like at night. She listened to the answers. She remembered them. 3 weeks in, she requested that my rotation be extended to include the council corridor, which put me closer to the actual working heart of the palace. Oren told me with clear surprise that in 40 years of service, he had never seen the Queen personally request a guard reassignment. She trusts you, he said, as though still processing it. I did not say it out loud, but I trusted her too. In a posting full of polite distance and careful management, she was the one person who treated me like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. And that is why, when I started noticing things about King Dravith, I could not simply let them go. The king was everything the court loved. Tall, even by Valdorian standards. Commanding, charming, politically sharp. His skin moved through colors fluidly and expressively, and he spoke to people in a way that made each one feel chosen. The nobles liked him, the staff liked him, the council liked him. When he entered a room, the entire temperature of it seemed to rise by several degrees of warmth. I noticed him the way you notice something that does not quite fit, but you cannot immediately say why. It started with the blink. Valdorians blink not as frequently as humans, but they blink in response to light changes. Dim to bright, bright to dim, as a natural eye adjustment reflex. I had watched enough Valdorian faces by then to know the pattern unconsciously. The king did not blink at those moments. He blinked on a fixed rhythm, steady and regular like a clock. It was small. It was easy to miss. I almost missed it. Then there was the shadow. One afternoon in the council corridor, the king walked past a bank of overhead lights that cast multiple overlapping shadows from slightly different angles. Every other person who walked through that corridor had 3 or 4 faint shadow copies, overlapping messily as physics required. The king had one. A single sharp shadow, exactly where it should be and nowhere else. I stood at my post and stared at the floor after he had gone, wondering if I had imagined it. I had not imagined it. I stood in that same spot the next day in the same light at the same time and watched 3 different staff members walk through. All of them cast multiple shadows. I took out the small notebook I carried. Old habit. My first trainer had told me that written notes survived system failures, and wrote down the time, the location, and what I had seen. That was the beginning of the 3rd file. I would eventually title things that are wrong with the king. The first two had been dismissed by my superior, Lieutenant Commander Aaron, senior Valdorian officer who reviewed my reports with the patient exhaustion of someone who had been managing human quirks for too long. Your perceptual baselines are calibrated to your own species. Sergeant, she told me after the second report, what appears abnormal to you may simply be individual variation. The king is under no clinical suspicion. I did not argue. I went back to my post, opened my notebook, and started a third file. My grandmother had a saying that I thought about often during those early weeks on Valdor Prime. She was a small woman from a cold northern town, and she had survived things that most people in her generation preferred not to discuss. Her saying was simple: the feeling that something is wrong is always faster than the words to explain it. Do not wait for the words. Valdorians did not have an equivalent saying. They were a species that trusted evidence, logic, documentation. Feelings were data, yes, they wore their moods on their skin, but gut instinct without measurable support was not something their culture had any particular respect for. I was not Valdorian. I wrote down everything: the blink pattern, the shadow, the 3 times I had noticed the king standing in a cold corridor without any visible change in his skin tone. Valdorians ran slightly. Warm and cold air typically produced a faint ripple of color at the neck and hands, a kind of involuntary shiver. Response: the king showed none. He stood in cold air like cold air meant nothing. I also wrote down something harder to quantify: that he listened. When the queen spoke to him in my presence, he responded correctly, the right words, the right emotional register, the right memories referenced at the right moments. But there was a lag, a fraction of a second between her speaking and his reply that was just slightly longer than natural conversation should allow, as though somewhere between hearing and answering something was being processed that did not process quite as fast as a living mind. On the 42nd day of my posting, I filed my third report. And GT snorts. And GT. Lieutenant Commander Aaron read it. Front of me, set it down and said, Sergeant Voss, I appreciate your diligence. I do not share your concerns. Please return to your post. I returned to my post. That night in my quarters, I pulled up my personal communicator and drafted a message to the only person I knew who might understand what I was describing. Dr. Nora Ossi was a xenobiologist at the University of New Meridian on Earth. We had grown up 2 streets apart, gone to different schools, and stayed in contact the way people do when they share a home city but not a career. Occasional messages, years apart, catching up on each other's lives in broad strokes. I sent her everything: the blink pattern, the shadow, the temperature response, the processing lag. I framed it as a theoretical question: what species or condition might produce these characteristics in a humanoid organism? Then I set my alarm, lay down on my narrow palace issue bed, and stared at the ceiling. The feeling that something is wrong is always faster than the words to explain it. I did not sleep well that night. I did not sleep well for several nights after. But I stayed at my post, watched the king move through his days, and kept writing everything down. Because humans did not survive 10,000 years on a planet that was actively trying to end them by ignoring the quiet voice that said, something here is not what it appears to be. I had no proof yet. I had no allies yet. I had a notebook, a growing file, and a gut feeling that the most powerful man in the Valdorian Empire was wearing someone else's face. That was enough to keep going, for now. It had to be. Dr. Nora Ase went quiet for 2 days. After I sent her my message. I know Nora, we had been occasional contacts for 11 years. She was the kind of person who replied to messages within the hour, usually with more questions than answers, always with that particular restless energy that made her excellent at her work and occasionally exhausting to talk to. 2 days of silence from her was not normal. 2 days of silence after I had sent her an unusual biological query was even less normal. I kept my post. I watched the king. I wrote in my notebook. On the morning of the 3rd day, her reply arrived. It was 3 sentences long. The first 2 were technical. Request to confirm 2 specific data points from my observations. The 3rd sentence, sitting alone at the bottom of the message like something she had almost not written, said, Kale, please be careful about how visible you are while you continue gathering this information. Not, this is interesting, let me look into it. Not, I think you might be misreading the data. Be careful about how visible you are, from a xenobiologist who studied life forms for a living. That was not a casual phrase. I confirmed her data points and asked her directly what she was thinking. She replied within the hour this time. I'm not ready to say it yet, she wrote. I need 2 more days. Keep watching. Don't change your behavior pattern. Don't ask questions out loud. Just watch. I was a soldier, following instructions, while not fully understanding the reason. For them was not a new experience. I did what she asked. I watched. The thing I want people to understand about living inside suspicion is that it changes the texture of every ordinary moment. The king was present at breakfast briefings, council sessions, public appearances, private dinners with the queen. I was not present for all of these, but my rotation had expanded enough that I saw him several times each day, and every time I saw him, I was looking, not staring, nothing that would draw attention, but cataloging, storing, writing it down afterward. The cold corridor response remained absent. Over 11 days of observation, I documented 14 separate instances of the king standing in temperature-shifted areas without any skin color response. Other Valdorians in the same spaces, same conditions, showed the reflex every time. The king showed it 0 times. When I mapped the timing against the natural variation I had observed in the rest of the palace population, the statistical probability of that being individual variation began to approach something that felt, even without formal analysis, like an impossibility. The shadow issue happened again, this time in the garden, mid-morning, hard sunlight coming from above and slightly south. I was posted at the garden gate. The king walked the central path with 2 council advisors. The advisors cast the expected shadows, slightly soft at the edges, slightly doubled where the path lighting mixed with sunlight. The king's shadow was single and sharp, like something cut from paper and placed on the ground precisely. I watched one of the advisors glance at the path. He saw the shadows. I watched his skin flicker, a brief fast pulse of Cool blue, and then he looked away and continued his conversation as though he had not seen anything. That flicker of cool blue was the Valdorian equivalent of a double take. He had noticed, but he had looked away. I wrote that down too. On day 9, I noticed something new. The king's hands. Valdorians have 4 fingers on each hand, longer than human fingers, with a slight iridescence to the skin over the knuckles, a structural feature related to their natural light pulse biology. In good light, this created a faint shimmer over the back of the hand during movement, like the surface of still water when a breath passes over it. Every Valdorian I had observed over 14 months showed this. It was not something they did consciously. It was just what Valdorian hands looked like when they moved. The king's hands did not shimmer in shadow, in low light, in bright light. His hands moved cleanly with no optical response. The skin over his knuckles was smooth and still, like something that had been very carefully made to look like Valdorian skin without being Valdorian skin. I filed my 4th report. Lieutenant Commander Aaron did not even call me in. This time, she sent a written response. It said, "Your concerns have been noted. You are advised to focus on your assigned duties, no further investigative activity relating to members of the royal family is sanctioned." That was the line that told me I was alone in this officially. Whatever I did next, I would be doing it without institutional support. I went back to my notebook and started a new section. What I had were observations. What I needed was a framework, some way of understanding what I was actually looking at. I was not a scientist. I had a secondary school education in biology, a military training course in field medical response, and 14 months of watching an alien royal court with more attention than was probably appropriate. I was not qualified to diagnose what was wrong with the king, but I was very qualified to recognize when something living was behaving in a way that contradicted everything else around it. Nora's second message arrived on the morning of day 11. It was longer this time. She had been working, I could tell from the writing. She gets very precise and slightly breathless when she has been deep in research for long hours. Sentences getting shorter, qualifications disappearing, just the facts in order. Wrote, "There is a parasite class. Extremely rare, not well documented, because confirmed encounters are fewer than 30 in recorded xenobiological history, called pale mimics. They are not technically parasites in the biological sense. They are predators. Solitary patient. They locate a host, study it over an extended period from close proximity, and then replace it. The host does not survive the process. The mimic assumes the host's full physical structure and behavioral archive. It is not a copy. It becomes a functional biological reconstruction. The difference is internal." She continued, "The differences you have describe the blink pattern, the shadow, the thermal response, the hand luminescence. These are consistent with pale mimic biology as described in the 3 most detailed accounts we have. The shadow anomaly in particular is significant. Pale mimics have a slightly different relationship with photons at the cellular level. It produces exactly what you described. I cannot confirm this remotely, Kale, but if I am right, the real king has been gone for a long time. What you are looking at is something that studied him, replaced him, and has Been waiting patiently, intelligently, for an opportunity that only the king's position could provide. I read that 3 times, then I sat very still for a few minutes. Then I wrote, "What opportunity?" She replied within 20 minutes. "Resonance chamber, it's the only thing." That makes sense given the timeline and the target, a pale mimic at this level of patience and intelligence, is not there for power or resources. It would need something biological, something that required the Queen's willing, unresisted participation. The resonance chamber bonds Valdorian pairs at a neurological level. Entry requires both parties to be fully present and fully open. If she enters that room believing she is safe, the mimic could use the bond to access and alter her neural architecture. Directly, she would not know it was happening until it was complete. I stared at my communicator screen. Then I wrote, "How long would it have been planning this?" She replied, "The 3 documented encounters suggest pale mimics are capable of maintaining a replacement for between 1 and 3 years before beginning the final stage. Given your observed timeline, I think the final stage is close, possibly very close." I put the communicator down. I looked at the ceiling of my small quarters for a long moment. Then I thought about the Queen. I thought about the way she had paused at my post on my 3rd day and asked me a real question. I thought about the genuine attention in her silver-toned eyes. I thought about the fact that somewhere in this palace there was a being of extraordinary patience and cold intelligence wearing the face of her husband, waiting for the right moment to reach inside her mind and take what it had come for. And I thought, not while I am standing here. The difficulty was obvious. I had no sanctioned authority to act. I had no allies within the guard. I had 4 rejected reports and a direct order not to pursue the matter further. Any action I took unilaterally would be a violation of protocol significant enough to end my career and, more relevantly, damage the interspecies relationship my posting was specifically designed to support. If I was wrong, the consequences would be severe and wide-ranging. But Nora's message had ended with something she clearly added last. Something blunt in a way she usually was. Not, "Get her out of that room if it comes to it. I don't care how, just get her out." Nora had spent 20 years studying life, every form it could take across the known galaxy. She did not use phrases like "I don't care how" lightly. She had looked at my data, matched it against everything she knew, and arrived at a conclusion she trusted enough to set aside her scientific caution. I trusted Nora. I also trusted my notebook. 2 days later, I was moved to an additional rotation covering the west wing corridor. Approach the corridor that led directly to the resonance chamber because one of the senior guards had taken ill and they needed a body at the post. Erin assigned me without apparent thought, purely out of scheduling necessity. I do not think she recognized the significance of the location in relation to my reports. I recognized it immediately. I took the post. I stood in the corridor that led to the resonance chamber, and I looked at the heavy carved doors at the far end, and I felt with absolute clarity that whatever was going to happen in this story was going to happen very soon. The Queen was scheduled for a private session with the King the following afternoon. I had seen the schedule posted in the council antechamber 2 days prior, a resonance bonding session. A renewal of connection that Valdorian couples undertook periodically, deeply. Private, no guards permitted inside. Entry by both parties, doors sealed. I had one day. I sent Nora a message that night, simple and direct. I need a xenobiological response team here as fast as you can. Arrange it, I don't have time to explain. The official channels, I need it done. Quietly, and I need it done before tomorrow afternoon. She replied 4 hours later, I'm already on my way. I called in every favor I have. We land tomorrow morning. Don't do anything before we arrive. I wrote back, I'll do my best. I did not sleep that night. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, running through every possible sequence of events, every way this could go wrong, every calculation I needed to make. If the team arrived in time, we had a process. If they did not, if the Queen moved toward that chamber before Nora landed, I would be standing at my post with nothing but my observations, my notebook, and the particular human stubbornness that had got me into trouble in every job I had held since the age of 17. I pulled out the notebook and read through everything I had written over the past 6 weeks, every detail, every anomaly, every moment when the evidence had stacked one more small weight onto the same side of the scale. By the time the light outside my window began to shift from black to deep violet, I had made my decision. If it came to it, if the Queen walked toward that chamber and Nora was not yet there, I would step forward. I would put myself between the door and the Queen, and I would say what needed to be said, regardless of what it cost me. I had no proof a court would accept. I had no authority anyone would sanction. I had a notebook full of observations and the absolute unshakable conviction of a man who had been watching very carefully for a very long time. Sometimes that has to be enough. I put on my uniform. I checked my sidearm, a standard human electromagnetic pulse model issued to me on the day I arrived and never once expected to be used. I walked to my post in the West Wing corridor, took snorts, my position beside the carved stone wall, and waited. The morning was quiet. The palace moved through its early routines, the soft sound of footsteps, the low conversation of staff, the distant hum of the atmospheric systems maintaining the perfect interior temperature that Valdorians preferred. The resonance chamber door stood at the end of the corridor, closed and still. I stood between them and the rest of the world, and I waited for whatever came next. She came through the West Wing door at the third bell of the afternoon. I heard her before I saw her, the measured pace of her footsteps, the faint shimmer of her formal robes against the stone floor. Queen Suring walked with that particular stillness I had learned to recognize over 14 months, the kind that spoke of someone who was fully present in every moment without needing to perform it. She was dressed for the resonance session. The robes were deep blue, and the iridescence of her skin pulsed softly with warm gold, the color of anticipation, of warmth of a woman walking toward her husband in an act of trust. I felt something tighten in my chest. Nora's ship had landed 40 minutes ago. I had received her message. She was at the palace gate requesting emergency xenobiological access, moving through the bureaucratic layers as fast as her credentials and considerable determination could carry her. She had estimated 20 minutes. That had been 30 minutes ago. The last message I had received said, held at secondary. Clearance fighting it, don't let her go. And the corridor was otherwise empty. The senior Valdorian guard who should have been posted at the chamber approach had been called to the outer courtyard for a routine briefing. I was alone at the post. The queen walked toward me with warm gold in her skin and trust in her eyes. And at the far end of the corridor, the great carved doors of the resonance chamber stood open 6 inches, open from the inside where the king was already waiting. I stepped forward, not to the side, not a polite shuffle to indicate attention, forward 1 full step into the center of the corridor. Directly in her path, she stopped, her skin shifted gold, cooling slightly toward the questioning silver I had come to know well. Sergeant Voss, her voice was calm, but there was a note of careful attention in it. You are at the West Wing post today? Yes, Your Majesty. Is there a security matter? The question was perfectly reasonable. Guard stepping into a queen's path in a palace corridor was either responding to a threat or committing a serious breach of protocol. I was, depending on how the next few minutes went, possibly both. I need to ask you to wait before entering the chamber, I said. I kept my voice steady. I looked her directly in the eyes. I know what I'm asking. I know what this looks like. I am asking. Anyway. Her skin went silver, fully, clearly. Silver, the color of complete focus. Explain yourself. The door at the far end of the corridor opened wider. The king stepped into the frame. He was, as always, extraordinary to look at. Tall, composed, with the confident ease of someone who owned every room he entered. His skin was warm gold, the color of welcome, of affection. And he looked at the queen with an expression of such perfect gentleness that I felt, for one terrible second, the possibility that I had been wrong about everything. Then he looked at me, and the gold did not shift. Valdorian emotional skin response was involuntary. When the king looked at me, the single human guard standing in his corridor, blocking his wife's path, there should have been something, annoyance, confusion, concern, some flicker of an involuntary response. There was nothing. His skin stayed a perfectly maintained warm gold, held like a painting rather than a living thing. Kale, he said, using my given name, which I had never given him permission to use. Is everything all right? I kept my eyes on the queen. Your Majesty, for the last 6 weeks I have been documenting anomalies in the king's behavior and physical presentation. I filed 4 reports with Lieutenant Commander Aaron. And GT snorts. And GT, all 4 were dismissed. I understand. That, I understand the weight of what I'm saying. I'm asking you as the guard assigned to protect your safety to give me 15 minutes before you enter that room. The queen was very still. This is extraordinary, the king said. From the end of the corridor, his voice was perfectly modulated, the exact tone of a patient husband mildly concerned about an unstable staff member. Sirring, he has been struggling with the adjustment to Valdorian service for some time. Perhaps we should call Aaron. You have never called me by my given name, she said, not to me, to him. The corridor was quiet. Sirring, his voice was still gentle, still perfect. I call you by your name all the time. In private, she said, her voice had gone very even. In council, in ceremony, in any presence of staff, you use my title. You have done so for 9 Years, it is a courtesy I asked for when we married, and you have honored it. Without fail. She looked at him across the length of the corridor. You have never called me by my name in front of a guard. The gold in her skin was gone. She was silver from her hairline to her hands. Full, absolute focus. The king said nothing for 2 seconds. It was not a pause of surprise or hurt. It was a pause of recalculation. I moved my hand to my sidearm, not drawing it, not presenting a threat, just making my hand available. Your Majesty, I said quietly, I have a xenobiologist waiting at the palace gate. Her name is Dr. Nora Ase. She has credentials in interspecies pathology, and she has been reviewing my documentation for 2 weeks. I am asking for 15 minutes for her to reach us. That is all I am asking. The Queen looked at me. What do you believe you have found, Sergeant Voss? I told her clearly, briefly, and without softening any of it. The blink pattern, the shadow, the thermal response, the hand luminescence, the processing lag, Nora's preliminary assessment, the resonance chamber, and what it was designed to do, and what Nora believed something in possession of that knowledge might want to use it for. I spoke for 4 minutes. The Queen listened without interrupting. Her skin stayed silver the entire time. When I finished, the end of the corridor was empty. The king was gone. The chamber doors were closed, and from the east end of the corridor, I heard footsteps, fast, purposeful, accompanied by the rapid voice of a Valdorian aide and the distinctly recognizable tones of Nora O's, asking very pointed questions about palace access protocols. Sergeant Voss, the Queen said. Yes, Your Majesty. Send for the full council guard, all senior officers. I want this wing sealed. She paused. And tell Dr. Ase to bring everything she brought. I got my communicator out and made the call. My hands were steady. I was mildly surprised by that. From behind the resonance chamber doors, something moved. Not a sound, or not exactly a sound. More of a pressure change, as though something on the other side of the doors had shifted its shape, and the air had needed a moment to understand what it was now occupying. The Queen heard it too, her silver glow deepened, not fear but absolute focused readiness. Sergeant Voss, she said very quietly. Yes, Your Majesty. Stand your ground. That, I said, is what I do best. The corridor was still, the doors were sealed, and behind them, whatever had spent months wearing a face it had no right to wear was running out of patience. So was I. The council guard arrived in 4 minutes. Nora arrived in 5, slightly breathless, carrying a field scanner that looked like it had been assembled from 3 different kits in a hurry. She took one look at me, one look at the Queen, and said, Tell me we're not too late. We're not too late, I said. She exhaled. Good. She turned to the Queen, composed herself into the professional version of herself that I suspected she had been practicing in the transport on the way over, and said, Your Majesty, I'm Dr. Nora Ase. I need to explain what we may be dealing with and what I need to do next. The Queen looked at her with that steady silver focus. You have 30 seconds to give me the summary, Doctor, then I want the full explanation while we figure out how to open those doors. Nora blinked once, then she nodded and started talking. Behind us, the sealed corridor filled with the sound of arriving guards, boots on stone, the metallic sound of equipment being readied. The palace was waking up to the reality of what had been living inside it. I stood at my post. I was exactly where I was supposed to be, and whatever came through those doors next was not going to get past me. The doors to the resonance chamber did not open for nearly 6 minutes. In those 6 minutes, Nora set up her field scanner, briefed 3 senior Valdorian officers with the speed and precision of someone who had practiced delivering difficult information to skeptical audiences, and managed to get 2 of them to a state that I would describe as cautious professional engagement rather than outright dismissal. The third, Commander Verk, long-serving officer with a face that appeared to have been carved by someone who thought expressions were unnecessary, stood very still, listened to everything, and then said with controlled deliberateness, "If this assessment is incorrect, the diplomatic and institutional consequences will be significant." "I know," Nora said, "if it's correct, and we do nothing, the Queen's mind gets rewritten by a parasite that's been wearing her husband's body for over a year. I'll take the diplomatic consequences." Verk looked at me. "You initiated this?" "Yes, sir. Based on personal observation and an unofficial external consultation." "Yes, sir." He was quiet for a moment. Then I read your 4 reports, Sergeant Vass, all of them. He did not explain why he had read them if he was not their recipient. He did not need to open the chamber. The chamber doors were designed to be opened from the inside as well, but the palace infrastructure included an emergency override, a fail-safe built into the original construction for exactly the scenario in which a person inside could not or would not exit voluntarily. Commander Verk used his senior command codes. The lock disengaged with a sound like a held breath being released, and the doors swung inward. What was inside the resonance chamber was not the king. It was standing at the far end of the room, still in his shape, still wearing his face, but something had changed. The posture was different. The precise, comfortable confidence was gone, replaced by something that stood very straight and very still, in the way that things stand still when they are recalculating rather than when they are calm. The warm gold of the skin had gone flat. Not another color, just flat, like a display that had been switched off. Nora's scanner was already running. She looked at the readings, and I watched her face go through 4 expressions in 2 seconds: disbelief, recognition, grim confirmation, and then the focused steadiness of a scientist who has spent 20 years preparing for the possibility of this moment, even while hoping she would never reach it. "It's a pale mimic," she said. "Confirmed." She looked up at Verk. "The biological signature is exact." Verk's skin went the deep, cold blue of formal shock. Around him, the senior guards shifted. I heard someone make a sound that was not quite a word in any language I knew. The thing wearing the king's face turned toward Nora when she spoke. "Dr. Asay," it said in the king's voice, "your research is impressive. 30 documented encounters in recorded xenobiological history, and you identified this one from secondary observation data." It sounded almost like appreciation. "Remarkable." "Thank you," Nora said with the specific flatness of someone who was not accepting the compliment. "Step away from the center of the room." "I don't think I will." What happened next is difficult to describe in any clean sequential way, because it happened very fast and in multiple directions at once, the mimic. Drop the shape not all at once, not the way things fall in simple physics. It unfolded, that is the only word that captures it accurately. The king's form peeled back layer by layer, each layer revealing something that was not quite the thing beneath, until what stood in the chamber was something that had no single stable shape, tall, translucent in places, deeply dark in others, with a surface that moved like water in a current even when nothing was touching it. It was not terrifying in the way that loud things are terrifying. It was terrifying in the way that wrong things are terrifying. The specific quality of wrongness that human pattern recognition has been responding to since before we had words for it, the deep ancient part of the brain that says this should not exist in this form. The Valdorian guards responded immediately. They moved to contain positions, and I will give them full credit. Not one of them ran, not one of them hesitated in a way that compromised the response. Whatever they felt, they did their jobs. I moved to the Queen's position. Protocol and instinct both said the same thing. Put yourself between the threat and the person you are guarding. I was at her side before I had consciously decided to move. Sergeant Voss, she said very quietly. Right here, Your Majesty. The mimic moved toward the center of the room, not toward any of us specifically, but in the way that things move when they are assessing options and finding them limited. It made a sound that I am not going to try to render in written form because I do not have the vocabulary for it. Low, resonant, layered in a way that suggested multiple sources rather than one. Nora from behind her scanner said, electromagnetic disruption, pulse, frequency between 40 and 80 kilohertz. Anything in that range at sufficient amplitude should disrupt the cellular cohesion mechanism. I looked at my sidearm, standard human issue electromagnetic pulse, adjustable frequency, range between 20 and 100 kilohertz. It had been given to me as a ceremonial sidearm, a diplomatic gesture, the sort of weapon that signals respect for human military tradition without anyone actually expecting it to be used. I had never fired it in the field. I drew it, set the frequency to 60 kilohertz, the midpoint of the range Nora had specified, the conservative choice, the calibration that said I was trying to achieve effect without being reckless, and I fired. The effect was immediate and significant. The mimic contracted. That is the best description I have. It pulled inward, its translucent surface rippling violently, and the sound it made shifted to something sharper and higher that I felt more in my teeth than my ears. It did not fall. It did not stop moving, but it slowed, visibly and substantially, and the Valdorian guards used the opening. They had, I later learned, a containment protocol for biological threats that had not been used in living memory, but had been maintained in their training systems for exactly the reason that highly intelligent, long-lived species maintain protocols for things they hope never to encounter. They executed it well. 3 guards with containment field generators created a perimeter. 2 more with contact disruption tools moved in from angles. Verk directed the operation with the calm of someone who trusted his people and trusted his training. I fired twice more, once when the mimic pushed toward the perimeter edge, and once when it turned toward Nara, who stood her ground with admirable and Slightly alarming steadiness, continuing to take scanner readings with the focused intensity of someone who knew she would probably never get another opportunity like this one and was determined not to waste it. The third shot put it inside the containment field. The field locked, the mimic hit the boundary, recoiled, hit it again, and then went still in the center of the enclosed space, shifting slowly through shapes that no longer had anything to do with the king or anyone else. Its own forms, whatever those were, the unmasked reality of something that it spent an unknown number of years wearing. Borrowed faces in borrowed places. Commander Verk looked at it for a long moment, then he looked at me. Your sidearm frequency, he said. 60 kilohertz, midpoint of the range. Dr. Ase specified. You knew the effective range. She told me in real time, sir. I adjusted. He was quiet for a few seconds. Sergeant Voss, I owe you a formal apology on behalf of this guard. Your report should have been reviewed with more serious attention. Thank you, sir. I'd rather have the acknowledgement than the apology if those are two different things. He looked at me with something that might have been the Valdorian equivalent of respect finally switching on. I will keep that in mind. The Queen had not moved from where I had positioned myself beside her during the entire exchange. She had watched everything, every moment of it with that silver focus that was, I had come to understand, her most natural state, not distance, not coldness, but absolute and complete attention to reality as it actually was. She looked at the contained mimic. She looked at the place where her husband had been standing for over a year and had not been standing for much longer than that. I saw something move through her expression that I did not know the name of and probably never would. Specific quality of grief that belongs to the discovery of a loss that had already happened without your knowledge. The grief of realizing that the absence began long before the moment of knowing. I stood beside her and I did not say anything. Some moments do not need words. After a long time she said, the real Dravith. Nora will determine the timeline, I said. Quietly, when she has something definite, we'll know. He has been gone a long time. I think so, Your Majesty. I'm sorry. She was silent for another moment, then she straightened, the subtle version of it, the internal kind of straightening that has nothing to do with posture and everything to do with what a person decides about what comes next. The court will need to be informed, the council, the public eventually. She looked at me. And you will need to be properly recognized. I was doing my job. You were doing considerably more than your job, Sergeant Voss. You were doing it without support, without sanction, and against direct instruction. That is not the definition of doing your job. She met my eyes with that full silver attention. That is the definition of courage. I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, which was, I think, the right choice. Nora appeared at my elbow, scanner hand, expression bright with the specific energy of a scientist who had just made the discovery of her career. Kale, the data is extraordinary. The cellular mechanism alone is going to rewrite 3 textbooks. She paused, looked at the Queen, adjusted her tone. I'm deeply sorry for the circumstances. Your Majesty, I wish we'd had more time to build a proper case before it reached this point. You arrived in time, the Queen said. That is what matters. Nora looked at me, I looked at her. We were two people from the same two-street radius of a city on Earth, standing in an alien palace in the aftermath of something that would be discussed in xenobiological literature for the next 100 years. "Good call sending me the data," Nora said. "Good call taking it seriously," I said. She nodded once, then turned back to her scanner because there was more work to do and she was never going to waste a moment when there was more work to do. I holstered my sidearm. I looked at the contained mimic slowly cycling through shapes in the field. I looked at the chamber where it had been waiting, patient as stone, for its moment that never came. Then I turned to face the corridor and took up my post. 3 weeks is a long time in a palace that has just discovered it has been hosting a centuries-old predator for an unknown period. I say centuries-old because that is what the full investigation eventually revealed. Nora and her team spent 11 days in formal residence at Valdor Prime, working with a Valdorian biological research team whose initial skepticism dissolved approximately 36 hours after they began analyzing the mimic in containment. The data that emerged was, as Nora had predicted, extraordinary. The mimic was not young. The best estimate, based on cellular structure and biological markers, placed its age at somewhere between 400 and 600 years. It had been doing what it did, finding hosts, replacing them, using what it needed, and waiting for the rest across multiple species and multiple generations. What it had wanted from the Valdorian royal line in particular took another week to piece together. A pale mimic of that age had moved beyond simple predation. It had developed something that Nora, in her formal paper published 4 months later, carefully described as long-term strategic integration, the ability to identify, over decades of patient observation, opportunities that would allow it to gain not just resources or survival, but lasting influence over a civilization. The resonance chamber bond, if completed, with the Queen as an unwilling and unknowing participant, would have given the mimic access to her neural architecture for the rest of her life. Not control. It was not capable of control in that direct sense, but access, influence, the ability to introduce thoughts that felt like her own. Over years, decades, it could have shaped policy, alliance, decision-making through a single invisible thread, connecting it to the most powerful individual in the Valdorian Empire. It had been watching for that opportunity for a very long time. Dravith had been gone for 14 months. The real king, the mimic, had replaced him precisely 4 months before I arrived at my posting, a timeline that Nora found particularly significant. She believed it had observed the interspecies cooperation program announcement and anticipated that a human guard might be assigned. A human guard represented an unpredictable variable. Humans had a reputation in the xenobiological literature for irrational persistence in pattern recognition, tasks, a tendency toward obsessive cataloging of anomalies, and a baseline distrust of things that were too perfect, that most other species, with their more refined cognitive filtering systems, did not share to the same degree. The mimic had known about us. It had known what we were like. It had counted on the institutional systems, the dismissals, the protocols, the polite management of the cooperative posting, to contain whatever a single human soldier might notice. It had miscounted When I read Nora's preliminary report and reached that section, I sat with it. For a while, the idea that something 400 years old, with full awareness of what humans were, had still not quite accounted for how stubborn a specific human could be when his gut told him to keep going, I found that unexpectedly satisfying. The recognition came in the form of 17 separate honors from various bodies of the Valdorian state, all of which had names I could not reliably pronounce and plaques I could not easily store in my small quarters. Commander Varek presented them with formal ceremony and a speech that included the line, "In the history of the Royal Guard, no individual has acted with greater effect under greater institutional resistance." I appreciated the honesty of that framing. He was not pretending my 4 rejected reports had not happened. He was acknowledging them as part of the record. Lieutenant Commander Aron requested a personal meeting. She was brief and direct. "I made an error," she said. "Your reports described a genuine threat, and I dismissed them inadequately. I have filed a formal self-correction with the Oversight Commission, and I am requesting a review of our anomaly report handling procedures." She paused. "I want you to know that I will personally ensure the review incorporates your methodology." I told her I appreciated it. She nodded. She was a precise person who was going to handle her mistake with precision, and that was the best anyone could do. The Queen met with me privately on the morning of the 16th day in a small garden room. I had never been inside before. It was not a grand space, simple, with plants that I did not know the names of growing in low containers along the walls, and a window that looked out over the eastern courtyard. She was dressed simply for a queen in a pale blue that made her silver focus look like something that belonged to the light itself. She asked me to sit, which was unusual enough that I did it without overthinking. She said, "I have been told that the formal recognition process includes an offer of permanent posting with elevation to senior guard status. If you choose to accept, this would be at your discretion. I want to be clear that the offer is genuine and is in no way connected to any expectation of obligation. Thank you, Your Majesty. And I want to ask you something that is outside the formal record." She looked at me steadily. "When you stepped forward in that corridor, you knew what it would cost you if you were wrong. You knew that being wrong meant the end of your career, damage to the interspecies program, and personal disgrace on a diplomatic scale. You knew that." "Yes." "And you stepped forward anyway." "Yes." "Why?" I thought about it honestly, the way I always tried to think about questions. She asked me because she always asked the kind of questions that deserved honesty, because the feeling that I was right was stronger than the fear of what happened if I was wrong, I said. "And because I had 14 months of watching you treat me like my presence here mattered. That kind of thing creates a debt." I paused. "Not the kind that can be repaid, the kind that changes what you're willing to do." She was quiet for a moment. In the light of the small garden room, her skin was a color I had not seen before, not the sharp silver of analysis or the warm gold of comfort, but something between them, something that seemed to hold both at once without being either. "In all of Valdorian recorded history," she said slowly, "there is no phrase that precisely translates to what humans mean when they say, 'I owe you one.' It's a casual phrase, I said. It doesn't really capture. I know what it means, she said. I have been learning about human idiom for 14 months, Sergeant Vass. Something that was almost amusement moved through the in-between color of her skin. I.O. You won. I smiled. I could not help it. I'll remember that, Your Majesty. She nodded once, stood, and walked to the window. There is something the Council has said in their formal report that I want you to know. She turned slightly toward me without fully turning. They wrote the Human Guards intervention cannot be fully explained by known tactical doctrine. They mean it as a professional observation about procedural gaps. I believe it means something else entirely. What do you think it means? It means that humans are not what we thought you were. She looked at me directly. We called you primitive. We called you charming. We called you an interesting experiment in diplomatic cooperation. We meant all of those things affectionately, and all of them were wrong in the same way. She paused. You are not unrefined. You are not unsophisticated. You are something that we, with all our precision and all our systems, did not have a category for. Another pause. You are unignorable. The word sat in the room. I let it sit. I'll put that on my next performance review, I said. This time the sound she made was unambiguously a laugh, brief, quiet, and genuine in the specific way of laughter that comes from being surprised by something. She turned back to the window. The formal review of the interspecies guard program is being accelerated. 3 noble houses have already submitted requests for human guard assignments. The Oversight Commission is drafting new anomaly report protocols with mandatory escalation pathways that cannot be overridden below senior command level. She paused. Nora Oz has been offered a permanent research residency at the Imperial University. She has accepted. I had not known that last part. I felt genuinely pleased by it. The program you were sent here to represent, the Queen continued, was considered by most of your military a diplomatic courtesy, a gesture without substance. It is no longer that. Whatever it becomes, it begins here. She looked at me over her shoulder. It begins with what you did in that corridor. I did not know how to respond to that. I settled for the simplest true thing I could think of. I was just watching carefully, Your Majesty. Yes, she said. That is precisely it. Watching carefully when everyone else had decided there was nothing to see. We were quiet together for a moment. Outside the window, the eastern courtyard was bright with afternoon light, the pale palace stone reflecting it back in the warm way that I had come to find genuinely beautiful after 14 months of living inside it. Are you going to accept the permanent posting? She asked, not pressuring. Simply curious. I filed my 5th anomaly report this morning. I said, there is a structural anomaly in the northwestern corridors atmospheric system that has been producing a faint vibration every 3rd evening cycle. The maintenance log shows no corresponding work order. I want to know why. She turned fully toward me. The in-between color was back in her skin, holding that quiet combination of focus and warmth, and my supervisor approved the report and opened an investigation. I let that sit for a second. I think they're finally learning. She looked at me for a long moment, then she said with great and precise deliberateness, Sergeant Voss, I would very much like you to stay. I stayed. I am still here. 3 months later at the post I chose. In the palace that has become something. I understand, among people I have come. To respect in the specific earned way. That respect only functions when it has been built under pressure. Nara is 3 floors up in the Imperial University's research wing. And GT snorts. And GT, making discoveries that are already generating more correspondence than she can answer and more questions than anyone currently alive knows how to address. She sends me message updates most evenings. They are long, detailed, and require a dictionary for the technical sections. I read every word. Commander Verak approved the new anomaly report protocol last week. It is thorough. It requires documentation. It requires escalation pathways, and it includes in the formal language of the Valdorian institutional record a clause that was apparently drafted with some debate but ultimately passed unanimously. The clause simply states, reports from all guard personnel, regardless of species or rank, shall receive equivalent formal review. No report shall be dismissed on grounds of the observer's perceived perceptual limitations. I read that clause twice when the official document came through, then I wrote it down in my notebook at the top of a clean page. There are 4 other human guards now in the Valdorian system. 2 are stationed at Noble House Post in the capital district. 1 is at the Port Authority on the orbital station. And 1 is here. A young woman named Lucy Carr, posted to the garden gate as her first assignment, who looked at me on her first morning with the careful attention of someone assessing whether the stories were accurate. I walked her through the palace on her first day the way Oren had walked me through mine, except I moved at a speed she could match. I showed her the council corridor, the garden, the throne room, the west wing. I told her the relevant history of each space. When we reached the western corridor, I paused at the post where I had stood for 6 weeks watching and recording, and I told her what had happened there, not the dramatic version, not the summarized version, the real version, the notebook, the 4 rejected reports, the 2 days of silence from Nora, the morning I stood alone at the end of that corridor with nothing but a decision. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "What made you keep going when they kept dismissing the reports?" I thought about my grandmother's saying. We have a phrase, I told her. Feeling that something is wrong is always faster than the words to explain it. She nodded slowly. What if the feeling is wrong? Then you were wrong and you deal with that. I looked at her steadily. But you keep watching carefully either way. That's the job, not just standing here. Watching, noticing, writing things down. Trusting what you see even when no one else does yet. She was quiet for a moment, then she looked at the corridor with the same steady attention I had seen in her eyes since she arrived, the particular quality of attention that humans have. The irrational, unbeatable, occasionally career-threatening tendency to keep watching even when the watching costs something. Right, she said. Welcome to the posting car, I said. She smiled. I turned and walked back to my post. Behind me, the palace moved through another ordinary day, full of life and color and the constant shimmer of people going about the complicated business of existing together across all The distances that separate us. Through the window at the end of the corridor, the violet sky of Valdor Prime was shifting toward copper at the edges. As afternoon tilted toward evening, I stood at my post and watched. Carefully. That is what I do here. That is what I have always done. And if something out there somewhere is counting on the systems and the protocols and the institutional inertia to keep a single, persistent observer from noticing the wrong shadow on the floor, it is going to be disappointing. We are very hard to get rid of once we have decided something matters. That is not a flaw. That is the whole point of us.